I'd like to welcome you to the third in the four-part series of Muslims in America. I think you will agree after today's tragic and unfortunate attacks in Brussels, Belgium, that this topic and these issues are extremely timely and important in fostering understanding and also a perspective that properly contextualizes what's happening in terms of today's events and also other similar events that occur around the globe. My name is Imad Houri. I teach in the International and Global Studies Department. I, along with Hannah Van and Dr. Bridget Trogdon, have been working together to try to organize this series. For tonight, our speaker is Dr. Abbas Barzegar from Georgia State University. He is an associate professor of religious studies and was gracious enough to accept our invitation to have him speak and enlighten us on some of the most contentious kind of lingo or terminology that is used, often in a very negative way, to describe the influence of Muslims and Islam generally in the West. So without any further delay, and I'll have Dr. Barzegar say a few things about his own background as well, I would like to make sort of a quick announcement before I hand it over to him, before I forget. So our next event in the series, our fourth and last event, is scheduled for Tuesday, April 19th, right here in this auditorium. It's at 6 p.m., and the theme for that evening is Religious Dialogue, Solutions for Peace. So we're going to be looking at how religion can be a constructive force rather than a destructive force. Also, the same evening at 7 p.m., there will be a reception hosted by the Women's Interfaith Alliance of Central Georgia. And this is an opportunity to further engage in dialogue and understanding and interesting and instructive conversation. So with that said, I would like to go ahead and welcome Dr. Barzegar.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Imad. If you don't mind, I'm going to go ahead and start our conversation down here to try to make it a little bit more intimate. I know that the flyer and the series is called "The Muslims Are Coming," but I feel like everybody's sitting so far away that you don't need to be so fearful. But genuinely, I really do appreciate you all putting on this conversation and inviting me to come down here, and I apologize for the delay both in my arrival and in the technical difficulties. I have a sort of standard conversation that I have about politics in the Middle East, about jihad, and about misperceptions around Islamic politics in particular, and Islamic movements, the things that we see on TV, and I try normally to educate folks about that context, but it's difficult to do that on a day like today when fresh in our mind are these attacks. I try very hard in those conversations to provide as much context as possible to recognize the conservative nature of these social movements that have occupied a large swath of Muslim life in the 20th century. I still want to have that conversation, but while I'm down here and while my computer's getting fixed, I'd like to spend the first 10 or 15 minutes of our conversation tonight about what happened in Brussels and about these kinds of terror attacks, okay? Because there is a world of difference between what we see in Brussels today and what we see in standard Islamic politics around the Middle East. And I really, really want us to be able to put a firewall between those things and understand how they relate to one another. And I believe that it deserves a separate conversation about radicalization, lone wolf terrorism, and how that happens in Europe, in the United States, etc. And so if we can imagine that we're going to have two really sort of distinct conversations this evening, I'd like to begin simply by being very, very upfront about the causes of radicalization, the sources of radicalization in some of these communities in Europe. And the problem is much, much graver in Europe than it is in the United States. And it is a very real conversation. It is a very real issue, and I don't want to skirt anything this evening. We spoke earlier, Imad and I, about how I end up giving a lot of these talks, because when I give these conversations, whether it's at civic groups, universities, or local churches, or even at other mosques, I tend to never pull any punches. I am not the guy who says Islam means peace and jihad is a spiritual struggle. I want to have an honest conversation with you, and I want to be able to hear your concerns. I want to hear what's out there, what's on your mind, so that I'm better equipped as a public educator to address those concerns. And so, look, we have suicide bombing of people that have been born and raised in Europe, all right? Young men often who find it somehow logical to kill civilians en masse whenever they might have the chance. What are these organizations? Who are these individuals? Where do they come from? Where do they draw their inspiration from? What are their motivations? I'll say at the very, very beginning that what you're dealing with is not an international issue. And this is one of the most difficult things for us to understand. In each one of these contexts, these are domestic issues. What you have are populations that have been marginalized, that have been living in ghettos, that have been living in a kind of subaltern status in European society, that are alienated both from their own heritages, wherever they might come from, and alienated from the society that they're supposed to be part of. Okay, whatever kind of online world these individuals live in, they have adopted and bought into an ideology where they feel empowered by committing these acts of violence. First and foremost, you have to understand that these individuals and these networks are almost never associated with standard mosque communities and the standard conventional Muslim communities in their own societies. A lot of times you hear things like, we need to understand what's going on in the mosques, we need to understand what's going on in the schools. Well, all of the empirical evidence shows that lone wolf radicalized terrorists operate in a world completely distinct from the standard Muslim community's institutions. And so the first people that suffer really from this radicalization are the Muslim communities themselves. They are oftentimes the targets of intimidation and violence by these individuals, by these networks, and the radicalization takes place largely underground and in online forums. I will not say that these radicalized lone wolf terrorists are brainwashed. I will not say that they are illiterate. The empirical evidence shows that oftentimes these folks are quite sophisticated in what they've learned, in their ideological commitments. They are grounded in their worldview, and they've come to a logical conclusion that this is somehow the way to go, the way to, the way to pursue their piety, the way to pursue their goals both here in this world and in the hereafter. What is it that they base their ideology off of? They're not opening up the Quran, okay, or the Prophet Muhammad's sayings in the Hadith and committing these acts. Instead, they are buying into a very clear, established line of militant Islamic ideology that has taken multiple manifestations over the course of the 20th century and has produced certain strands of radical violent extremism. We as researchers know exactly what organizations, intellectuals these individuals are influenced by. We can monitor them and follow their activities and their ideologies and their thinking very much in the same way that we would follow the thinking of Christian militia groups out in the Midwest or in the mountains of Colorado where I'm from. There's a clear trajectory that leads to this kind of violence, and it doesn't come directly from the Islamic texts. Instead, they come from a long line of militant interpretation. Now, what is it that they're mad about? What is it that they're arguing about? There's a general sense in the Muslim community that the overall Muslim community, and here we're going to get into sort of larger thinking about political Islam. There's a general sense out there, shared by lay Muslims, by political activist Muslims, that the Muslim community, the Ummah, is what people refer to as the Muslim, worldwide Muslim community. Muslims, we use this term very much in a way that's similar to the way Christians talk about the church, okay? Just the church, or the body of believers. There's a strong sense that the Ummah, or the global Muslim community, is like a body. And there are sayings from the Prophet Muhammad directly that militant activists in particular will draw upon that say, if one part of the body hurts, then the whole body is hurting, that the whole body is injured. And so Muslims who buy into this kind of ideology And it's very easy for many alienated Muslims to buy into this because they're aloof from their own grounded heritages. They're aloof from the societies that they live in. They can buy into this sense of global community. When they see the suffering of actual political grievance around the world, and people have to understand this, of actual political grievance around the world, when they see that suffering and they identify with it, you know, that identification starts, believe it or not, as hard as it may be to accept, it starts from a place of love. It starts from a place of sympathy, okay? And the worldview that they slowly and slowly subscribe to increasingly demands that they take action. And so the worldview of the militants that are out there, the Al-Qaeda intellectuals, et cetera, and we have generations of scholars that kind of buy into this, creates a stark image, a stark dichotomy between the West, or the non-Muslims, and the Muslims. And the writings of people like Ayman al-Zawahiri, who was Osama bin Laden's mentor and is now the current head of Al-Qaeda. If one reads these texts, I will tell you that they are powerfully seductive. They are powerfully and beautifully written, and they have a kind of theological weight to them that the untrained lay eye will not be able to defend themselves against. Okay? And Muslim communities, often immigrant-based, often not versed in these kinds of conversations, often very, very apolitical, often very neglectful about the challenges of integration, they have lost a generation of their own children in Europe, in the UK, in the United States. And so when these children are aloof, and these young men in particular, and in Europe it's exacerbated because of lack of employment and these other things, when they're aloof, it's very easy for them to fall into these sorts of traps, okay? But they do it consciously. It's an ideological problem. Most of the radicalization that takes place is a problem of ideology. So how is it that you're supposed to fight these kind of things? I'll tell you what does and doesn't work, it seems. What doesn't work are broad stroke condemnations of Muslim communities. Okay, broad stroke condemnations that Muslim institutions aren't doing enough. How many times have you heard, well, where are the Muslims protesting? I'll show you tonight, okay, if we can get this computer to work. I don't know of any legitimate Muslim institution that doesn't take a stand on these issues. Quite frankly, it's exhausting because nobody here in this community, in the churches that you go to on Sunday mornings, would be asked, or even would you even think to say to yourselves, you know, maybe we should issue a statement of condemnation for what the Lord's army did in Africa last week with its child soldiers. That would never even cross your mind. But somehow Muslims have taken it upon themselves to apologize for almost every act or make a statement about every act that's done in the name of their religion. But these are criminals. These are criminals alienated who work through criminal syndicates, get radicalized, etc. But Muslims still consider it important. I mean, literally on the drive over here, just about 20 minutes ago, I got a text from a friend of mine who he manages a website in Atlanta called atlantamuslim.com, and it's kind of a crowdsourced, news and blog site for Muslim activities and things like that. So he texted me and a group of other professors. He says, if you guys have any statements about what happened in Brussels today, please let us know. I'm putting together an article. Okay? I mean, that's the kind of urgency that's there. He says, the deadline's 9 p.m. Call me, I'd like to have your input. Okay? I mean, literally that sort of thing happens. It happens on a regular basis. So what isn't the answer is to alienate further the Muslim institutions and organizations that are the only allies that we might have in addressing those sectors of the community that have gotten past the reach of somebody like myself, okay? What does work is to employ, or I should say engage, those Muslim leaders that are capable of reaching those audiences. Now, who's capable of doing that? How many interfaith organizations have you been to? Interfaith activities have you gone to? There are plenty of nice Muslims out there that you can interact with, right? Okay, turn on the TV. You're going to find a Muslim talking about Rumi. You're going to talk about jihad means love, okay? I'm not here to tell you that. The people that need to reach out to the conservative, alienated, militant youth are the conservative, non-militant, anxious, upset, type of Muslims that are out there, but have education, who have a way of addressing these individuals, who can actually de-radicalize these individuals. Let me tell you a rather, sort of, it's a painful anecdote that I experienced about 10 years ago. I was asked to go out to Noonan, Georgia. People know where Noonan is, right? And it was this wonderful church that asked me to come out for 2 Sundays in a row and give, 2-hour sessions each Sunday on a kind of intro to Islam. The first session was going to be about kind of medieval theology, etc., foundations, origins, and the next one is going to be about modern contemporary things. And we had a wonderful session. I have to say, out of all of the things that I've done, this was one of the best sessions that I've ever had. And they decided upon themselves that they would organize, sweet folks from Noonan, that they would organize a church van to come and visit a mosque in Atlanta so they could get to know the Muslim community. They thought everybody would be like me, okay? Now, the Muslim community, by and large, the mosque-going Muslim community, resembles something like an Orthodox Jewish community, all right? It's very insular. The lifestyles are insular. The eating habits are regulated by a certain kind of Sharia custom. So, for the most part, the mosque communities that are governed by the old guard, if you will, tend to be quite conservative and quite insular, and often ethnically homogenous. So you might have all Arab, or all Pakistani, or all Kashmiri, or something like this. I was new to the city. I had just started my PhD at Emory, and the only mosque I could really find that would be suitable to receive these folks during the month of Ramadan were the mosque right downtown in Atlanta, the 14th Street Masjid. And I didn't really have contacts there. I was just hoping for the best. I figured everything would go well. And nice group of folks from Noonan, Georgia show up. They have dinner with us after Ramadan, and we have a little gathering. And, we got sort of past the basic stuff. And one fellow asked from the church, he said, "We know that Al-Qaeda does not represent Islam." Okay, softball question here. We know Al-Qaeda doesn't, represent Islam, and we know that the militants do not represent your beautiful tradition. But how is it that you feel when you see Osama bin Laden, declaring war on the United States and killing civilians? Okay. And so the fellow who looks like he could have been bin Laden's bodyguard says to him, and this is a stark response, but there's truth in it. He says, "Well, the issue isn't killing. Sometimes you got to kill." He says the issue is that bin Laden has crossed the boundaries of permissible acts of warfare. And that was his answer. The guy could have said it in a different way, okay? He could have said it in a different way, but it just shut down all conversation, and it just, destroyed the evening, and I never got invited back to that church, and I don't know what's going on, okay? But what that conservative gentleman said is the tool that we have to be able to accept. Islamic law and ethics has a tradition of regulated warfare, very, very similar to the Catholic tradition of just war. And for scholars of religion, we go back and we recognize that there's actually a symbiotic relationship between the development of just war doctrine and the development of jihad doctrine. Jihad is Islam's just war theory, and there are regulations about when you can declare war and how you can fight during war. It is the just war tradition. And the only people that can draw back militants from the field are the conservative Muslims that are dedicated to a Sharia-oriented understanding and worldview and can de-radicalize the militants. And so what some of the scholars that we have at the university that are interested in de-radicalization and whatnot, we actually have access to some of the rehabilitation programs in Pakistan and Saudi Arabia where militants have been brought back from the field and have been re-educated theologically to understand that although they have legitimate political grievances, according to their own religion, they will be going to hell if they engage in these kinds of acts of combat. Now that's a hard pill to swallow because we'd like to think that these nice kids that grow up in London should just go to college, get a job, and be liberal and have girlfriends and live a nice little lifestyle. Well, the truth is that you're dealing with conservatives in any religious tradition that have an entirely different worldview. So if we come to these individuals and we come to these networks with a liberal approach, promoting democracy, human rights, and these sorts of things that we hold dear to our own identity, we're not really interested in communication. We're not really interested in solving a problem. And so I've brought a PhD student of ours this evening who works with us on a big project we have around this buzz term called countering violent extremism. And we're spending the next 3 years going around the world studying Muslim approaches to de-radicalization and countering extremism. And it's a very, very enlightening conversation. And we'll say that Muslims are doing everything that they can. And they're the ones on the front line, and we want to find what solutions work for them, what solutions don't work for them. And it's an extremely frustrating landscape to be a part of. But once you get into the zone of militant activity, you're really dealing with a policing and security situation, and you're dealing with criminals. Muslim elites deal with these individuals like criminals, and Western governments deal with them like criminals. But there is something that has happened where we only look at them through the lens of civilizational confrontation. We look at them through the lens of differing values. We look at them through the lens of cultural clash. And that is not the approach. We are in much more danger existentially from Mexican drug cartels than we are from ISIS. For some reason, we're not scared of a whole lot of scary things in our society, all right? I mean, there are scary things, and we're not scared of any of those. But somehow my next door neighbor is deathly afraid of ISIS. And the only thing that can beat that is a sober analysis of the problem itself. So when President Obama gets lambasted and ridiculed for saying that ISIS is not an existential threat, well, that's a very educated statement. ISIS in no way is an existential threat to U.S. society. It's not an existential threat to the Middle East. It's a criminal gang that took over a couple towns in the desert in the middle of the Middle East. That's all it is. Drug cartels have more power. I'm telling you, Mexican drug cartels, pound for pound, have more power than ISIS. Okay? ISIS is nowhere near acquiring nuclear weapons or chemical warfare or anything like that. Okay? They don't have submarines the way that the Mexican drug cartels do. All right? All right? And so what is it in our own frame of reference that does not allow us to look at the problem in a very sober way? All right? And this is what I want to do by being able to separate the very serious security threat that we have from radicalized, ideologically driven, lone wolf criminal networks that may pop off at any given time, that we have limited ability to monitor, limited ability to stop, but that police and intelligence agencies all around the world are doing the best that they can to manage the situation. How do we separate that from understanding conservative groups in the Middle East that have legitimate political goals and ambitions and who participate in politics, who have been working for generations to come up with a viable, religious, faith-based orientation to their own society? I'll tell you right now that the mainstream Islamists that you hear about, or that you don't hear about, but the mainstream Islamists that are out there, all right, governments like, believe it or not, the Islamic Republic of Iran, all right, the ruling party in Turkey, in Tunisia, the Muslim Brotherhood that was brought to power in Egypt. These groups are light years away from the Al-Qaedas and from the ISIS, and they're actually fighting and dying with Al-Qaeda and ISIS constantly. They're constantly fighting them. But we have to be able to understand that those groups are really not that much different than some of the folks that are racking up, the votes in the Tea Party. Okay, they're not that different. They're conservative political activist groups. I want to be able to introduce some of the broad contours of that ideology of those movements tonight. Before I move into that stage of the talk, and I'm going to actually show you a clip because there's one movie clip. It's only about 10 minutes long from the History Channel, believe it or not, but they really got it right on this one. That I think explains it well and kind of can set the stage for some broader conversations. But before we go there, I want to be able to close out this conversation and entertain some questions just on this radicalized terror threat. I mean, the stuff that we see in San Bernardino, stuff that we saw in Brussels, anything that I might be able to answer or suggest. But I'll go ahead and bring the microphone around. Go ahead.
Doctor, first of all, thank you very much, because this is the clearest explanation I've ever received of this. You mentioned at the very inception of your remarks regarding the perceptions. What, if anything, is being done to help those of us who are not perceiving it the way I now perceive it now, presently from what you said? Is there any movement, or is there any concentrated study on studying how to get this kind of information or this perception to the rest of the world? Because I come away with a very thwarted view, basically, of what you, had you not spoken tonight, I'd still be walking around as ignorant as I was. But is anything being done to bring about what you're talking about, to let the world know this? Because it becomes we working together, or it becomes all of us become us instead of us and them.
No, thank you for your, thank you for your question. The truth is, I'm involved in a lot of different kinds of organizations and institutions. My wife, 10 years CNN producer and editor, and she has to work with these things on the front lines. Every institution out there, whether it's media, a civic group, anything like that, has some kind of political demand or obligation somewhere. Truth is, I can speak to you like this because I'm a professor, and we have a lot of freedom here, right? And I'm able to talk very openly with you. But let's say an organization that's dedicated itself to interfaith activity and has followed a very sort of solid line about apolitical conversations, okay? And they've been doing that for 10 years. Well, it's very hard for an organization like that to switch gears and start talking politics, and start talking politics in a very educated way, right? And so we don't find much activity in the interfaith circuit that can have this conversation. In the media, it's about dollars, right? So if it bleeds, it leads. We don't expect much out of them. And in advocacy organizations, Muslim American advocacy organizations, there is some work, but most of the driving narrative out there is that Muslims feel excluded, or they feel that they are perceived as being excluded from the society. So a lot of the activity of the major institutions is bent at sort of countering this Islamophobia or kind of anti-Muslim racism that's going on. And the answer to that, the way that they present it, is oftentimes, look at us, we're great Americans, right? And they get the, Rumi and Sufi-oriented Muslim to come out and show the cardiologist and the businessmen and things like that. And, there's very few opportunities to kind of get to it. So I'm sorry, but I don't really have a great example of groups that are doing this sort of work in a very concerted way. One thing that I can say is that I recently had a very successful two-week presentation at St. Philip's Episcopalian, which is the Archdiocese of the Episcopalian Church in Buckhead in Atlanta. And they wanted to continue the conversation. And I said, look, at the end of the day, we could have a lot of ideas and a lot of conversations, but what really has to happen is that as people of faith, committed to God's work, and committed to doing good work, what we need to do is simply agree to disagree on certain points and learn from each other, with each other, through service and doing God's work together. And so what we've tried to do there, I teach at a small seminary that we have in Northeast Atlanta, just as a side thing. And what I'm planning on doing there is having those students make it part of their curriculum to sort of embed themselves with the Christian partners and do some Habitat for Humanity work, some homeless care work, and things like this, and build lasting institutional relationships of interfaith service instead of interfaith conversation. It's enough cookie and coffee, we need to start really working together, and I want the conservatives to get together. The other day somebody called me and said, can you give a talk at a church? I said, which church? He said, the Unitarian Universalists, and what's not a slight at all to them, but I said, I don't want to talk to that group, because it's preaching to the choir. I don't need to convince them about anything. I don't need to have and they're great folks. I've talked to them in the past, but there's no progress being made there. And so for me, the challenge is really how do we build institutions that are dedicated to having the hard conversation. I think we spoke, what's the professor's name? Dr. Gushi? Gushi. So does he teach down here on occasion? Okay, so I gave a great talk with him at Candler one time. And to me, that was great because we both knew our boundaries and our faith commitments. And we were able to talk openly about kind of the conservative elements in our communities and the challenges we face as conservative-leaning folks ourselves. But that was a very robust conversation. So I really like doing that. But it's all a work in progress, you know, and we're trying hard. But I'll tell you, it's a seriously uphill battle. But I mean, events like this are extremely important, obviously, but the follow-up is also important. So one of the reasons I accepted this invitation was to meet the folks involved in Mercer on a mission, so we can build those relationships more. I mean, that's my real intention of being here, is the follow through there. So, any other questions about the terrorism stuff? About radicalization, about the real kind of...
Not really a question. Would you mind repeating or at least trying to go back over when we talk about some of these youth, let's say that came or are radicalized and are no longer understanding the just war side of the coin, which I have a concept of what you're talking about. When you talk about bringing them back and putting them back through what I consider, what I think heard you say, a learning process, so that you're trying to actually let them really fully understand the depth about the Muslim faith. Is that what I understood?
Yeah, absolutely.
And during that, I thought I might have misunderstood, and that's why I want to kind of repeat it. Is there something about Sharia law that plays a part in that, or did I miss what you
Perfect, yeah. So Sharia is, you know, if you translate the word in its original Arabic, it literally means way to the watering hole. In classical Arabic, even pre-Islamic Arabic, it means the way to the oasis. What's important to recognize about that is that Muslims believe that the Sharia is a roadway towards not salvation, but fruition in this life and in the hereafter. To live a fulfilled life both here and in the hereafter, one should follow the mandates of the law very much the way that the Jews follow the halakha, which is the regulated divine mandates. This can mean everything that you can possibly think of. By definition, Islam, Judaism, consider the law to be all-encompassing. There is not an aspect of human life that should be outside of the boundaries of the regulation of the divine word somehow. So everything from your ritual stuff all the way to issues of government, taxations. I mean, you have to realize we have Islamic law about cloning, about nail polish, okay? I'm not joking, about marshmallows, literally. What else are some kind of quirky ones? About organ transplantation, biomedical, about transgender operations. You know, I mean, there is nothing. So one of the elements, one of the chapter books in every classic Islamic law book that's out there on Sharia is Jihad. And when you open it up, it doesn't talk about your personal struggle, you know, and your spiritual struggle the way that many of us have heard here or there. It talks about how to conduct warfare and when it's okay to engage in war. It is just war theory through and through. And so this is how I teach it in my courses. So what those who are engaged on the front lines of de-radicalization or actual counter-extremism, counter-terrorism on the level of kind of ideology, what they are engaged in is a re-education of the proper boundaries and interpretations of the Sharia. Because the interpretation that is dominant in groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda is an outlier. I don't like to use the word perversion or something like this because I don't want to make it sound like it came from nowhere, okay? You know, it draws upon a just war or a kind of a conquest period, interpretation of jihad that existed amongst one old school of Islamic law that literally didn't exist in practice for about 1,000 years. And so, just to be specific for those who know a little bit about Islamic law, there are four schools of Sunni Islamic law. One of them is called the Hanbali school of law. It's always been the most austere and conservative. And even within that school of law, there was a kind of renegade group a long time ago that believed in a kind of vigilante justice and interpretation of Sharia and jihad, and they believed that everybody had the mandate to do this, okay? Most of the overwhelming majority of Islamic interpretations of jihad have declared that you have to have just like just war theory, proper authority to execute and declare war and to engage in war. And so any kind of martial activity would be illegitimate without the sanction of the reigning kind of Muslim leader. This renegade group that was active, really in the mid-10th century or so, took very seriously a kind of vigilante posture. And the writings and propaganda that we read from ISIS today, when we look at them, they're only quoting the Quran and the Sunnah, the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, and maybe a couple random scholars here or there in the past. And you think that that's just what Islam is. But for somebody who's educated in the history of this stuff, you recognize that those are direct interpretations brought from that renegade school of law, all right? And so who can bring that into reign? It's the Wahhabi government of Saudi Arabia, because that's their runaway child. They're the ones best equipped to actually bring them back in. And you'll be amazed. They've been doing this for like 10 years. They would have soap operas during Ramadan, okay, that would have sort of the bad Muslim leader and the good Muslim leader, and the kind of a stray youth, the people who wanted to fight and engage in terrorism, and their whole public service kind of announcements to try to rein this stuff in. And there was a process of re-education, which is why the guy at the mosque who said the problem isn't with killing, okay, when he said that, it sounds harsh, but when he said the problem is with superseding the boundaries of Sharia and going past the boundaries of Sharia, Osama bin Laden has made a mockery of that, and that becomes prohibited Islamically. That's actually the right answer. It's just, he needs a PR person to make it sound better. Right behind you, sir.
That 25-year-old jihadist who's a terrorist who goes into a shopping mall and blows up a bunch of non-Muslims, so he dies. Now, what does he believe is going to happen to his soul when he dies blowing himself up to get rid of all these infidels? And what do you believe is going to happen to his soul?
Yeah, he thinks he's going to heaven, he thinks he's going to heaven because there is a very strong martyrdom tradition within the jihad tradition. To fight and sacrifice, for the cause of God in a just way is one of the highest things that you can do. I mean, that's standard, right? I mean, and that's not very foreign to us. I mean, for patriot Americans, that's understandable, right? So he thinks that he's engaged in a just war. So he thinks he's going, and I think he's got, a surprise waiting for him. So, so I don't think that, yeah, I do believe that he's going to hell, but I believe most of us are going to hell. So, no, I don't. No, I'm sorry. That just brought up a conversation I had with a friend the other day. Look, the truth is that I do believe that he's in for a severe punishment. And I do believe that God will torment him in the hellfire, and that there's not really an escape for him for that at all. And I firmly believe that. And look, the truth is that it's my duty as a Muslim. Okay, let me take my professor hat off now. It's my duty as a Muslim to stop him with my life if I have the opportunity. All right? And so this weighs very, very heavily on us, And I would gladly do as much if I was given that opportunity, right? And so that's scary, but it's real. Okay, let's see. We have a couple back here.
I just have one question, or I have a number of questions, but one pertaining to the issues that we talked about when we first came in. Talking about the amount of people, I think everybody can hear? Yeah.
I was thinking about the amount of people at, how to best express this. The media often turns to CAR, the Council on Islamic American Relations, for statements on any type of activity that goes on. And we pretty well know that CAR has in the past indulged in certain illegal activities. If they are the go-to people that are expressing the religious connotations for the Muslim as a community or as a national asset, then some of us become a little concerned about that.
Okay. The question about the organization CARE, right? Council of American Islamic Relations. But do you want to go ahead and elaborate on the illegal activities that they've been engaged in?
Well, from what I've read, they were unindicted co-conspirators in at least 2 cases where money laundering and the gathering of funds to be sent overseas through shell corporations to various extremist groups that were at that point engaged in actively fighting against U.S. forces.
There's one more question I want to take, and I'll answer both at the same time.
You mentioned about the conservative Muslims and how that they realize the lost souls have taken the interpretation of jihad too far. Long story short, am I right about that? And so the conservatives are trying to bring that ideology back into the correct interpretation of the jihad. What can the West do to aid in that in a way that is effective? Because it seems like what the conservatives are trying to do, it seems like they would need help. And what feasible way can professors, people who are trying to understand and relate with Muslim traditions, how can we best help these conservative Muslims?
Okay, let me start with this last question first, which is, what role do outsiders have in helping this? This is actually one of the things that's coming up through our research right now that we're doing. We're preparing a report to present in Washington at the beginning of May on what some of the Muslim groups are doing. And repeatedly, they say that governments, Western governments in particular, and even Muslim governments, should stay out of this work, okay? Because the involvement of government is seen as a taint to the authenticity of these groups. So that might seem like it renders us sort of paralyzed. But the truth is that there's all kinds of other work that needs to be done to mitigate the hostility and negative forces and misinformation that exist within our own community. So to get back over to your question. So what kinds of things can we do for us to recognize that in Islam, there are denominations? People don't recognize that there's denominations in Islam, just like in every other religion, that there's not simply sects, but there's different orientations, okay? You know a bunch of Christians that quote the Bible straight off the Bible, right? Well, they don't speak for the Bible, and you know that. You know they come from that school and that kind of thought, or they're that type, right? You know a bunch of Jews that do the same thing. We don't have that level of education, okay? We don't have that level of education, and there's a cultural war within the United States where teaching about Islam and Muslims is a taboo, okay? So what can really be done is that in our public education system, we can have a more robust religious studies curriculum that begins within middle school, that is a kind of multicultural, multi-religious, basic sociology, history of comparative religion. A lot of public education systems don't even want to have that. We should not shy away from having controversial conversations about religion at the high school level. It should be mandatory that we do this as part of a civics almost, kind of course, so that we actually understand it, okay? We also have to recognize, and this will lead into the second question, the kind of hostility that we have in our society over Islam is represented in our government, okay? And so different bureaucracies within the US government fight amongst themselves, and they are influenced by outside lobbies, they have their own interests, etc. And there is an industry, you have to recognize, there is an industry within the Federal Bureau of Investigation whereby detectives and police are promoted if they can bring terrorism-oriented cases to court. And so what is an unindicted co-conspirator? What is that? If there's evidence of criminal activity, I'm mad as a taxpayer that the job wasn't done to take them to court. Okay? Let's bring those things out into court. Okay? There are genuine problems out there, and there are genuine criminals out there in the Muslim community. There are terrorists out there. There are people that are engaged in money laundering. Okay? And they should be brought to justice. But let's bring the evidence out. Why is it that we have literally hundreds of people on an unindicted co-conspirator list after 9/11? The same fellow who gave the first Muslim prayer to Congress is an unindicted co-conspirator. Well, why isn't he arrested? Why is he still allowed to walk around New York City then? What kind of atmosphere of fear do we have out there? But to be honest about CARE has historical links to the Muslim Brotherhood, which is seen as a sort of militant, organization that has links to groups like Hamas and others, and so they've been targeted quite a bit by different agencies and different organizations to try to expose some kind of links to extremism. They are conservative. They do have certain political leanings, and I should say that they represent themselves. In Atlanta, for example, the CARE chapter has been largely shunned by the rest of the community because they're afraid of its they're afraid of its branding of sorts, But in other places like Detroit, they're a very vibrant chapter, very vibrant branch, and it's not the case that everybody in CARE is a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's a big organization, it's a big institution, but there are many other organizations that represent Muslims in America. The biggest umbrella organization is a group called the Islamic Society of North America. This is the largest umbrella organization of Muslim mosques, and that's a group that is very well established and works very closely with different government agencies and state and local agencies and whatnot. So Islamic Society of North America, one group that I'm a fellow of is called the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, and our director of research is a former White House consultant. She was actually active, I believe, in the Bush and Obama administrations, Dalia Magahid, and the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. We've actually just released a report about Muslim American political attitudes for this for the election year. And so there are a number of organizations out there that represent Muslims, and CARE is only one of them. So it looks like it's about 7 o'clock. How are we feeling? Good? Good to go? Okay. What I'd like to do is there is an underlying sense, and I want to be very clear about this, that Islam is a faith of action. Okay? One of the most guiding Quranic principles that repeats itself over and over again, both in the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad's life, is the mandate to enjoin good or promote good and prohibit evil. Okay? And almost invariably, when God speaks to mankind as well as Muslims, he says, "O you who believe and do good works." And the notion of faith in Islam is always related to the level of your activity in terms of devotion as well as social action. So although there is this sense similar to Christianity where one is a member of the Muslim community and is a Muslim just by declaring a statement of belief, it doesn't stop there. That's just the beginning point. Rather, faith goes up and down, it's understood, by your level of devotion and activity, your social worth. And these two words throughout the Quran are always put together. Those who believe and do good work. Amanu wa amilu. Okay? Those who act and believe together. So Islam has always been seen from its beginning, and this is a core mythology of Islam. All Muslims around the world will believe this, that their faith is incomplete without good work, without social activity. And social activity means political activity sometimes, okay? And that can go in a number of different directions. I want us to think about what this world map looks like on a large scale. The Eastern Mediterranean, and just as it's going through things, the Eastern Mediterranean the Arabian Plateau, the Red Sea, Persian Gulf, and Indian Ocean, before the integration of the Western Hemisphere in the global economy and political system, this was the center of the world. In many ways, it still is, right? This was the center of the world. And so it was the mandate of the Persians and the Greeks. Whoever controlled this land space controlled the whole world. And so you can see that there is a constant battle for this land space. And with the rise of Christianity, you have the rise of a kind of monotheistic imperial rivalry that takes place across this region. You just saw the rise of Islam. But what is it doing? As an imperial order, it's simply mimicking what's been happening for the previous 2,000 years. You guys all know Salahuddin. Our good old buddy Genghis Khan says hello. The Ottoman Empire is the last great standing Muslim empire, and European colonialism begins to sort of control the Middle East. And slowly, what was a unified, or at least sort of solidified Islamic imperial space is taken over by a European system of modern nation states and nationalism. These are all foreign political structures, ideologies, philosophies, political theories that have literally chopped up the Middle East into a kind of colonial and modern output. It is not the case that Muslims didn't want that. Muslims participated in that as well. But it is much different than what existed just 200 years ago. And the majority of angst in the Muslim world today is a kind of nostalgia for when Muslims had a glorious past, but suffered a kind of brutal experience underneath colonialism, that they were complicit in themselves, but to try to find themselves in the modern world today that is so starkly different than the nostalgia that they had about their past. And so some of the greatest poets and writers and political philosophers reminisce. Our own children are taught about the scientific discoveries of medieval Muslim scientists, of doctors. And Muslims today are eager to revive not just their personal faith, but their civilizational impact. And so they're constantly on the move to try to bring up an indigenous, authentic answer to the impact of colonialism and modernity. Some of those responses have been radical, strident, anti-colonial, violent, revolutionary. Some of them have been very slow-paced, cultural, social-oriented, service-oriented. But the swath of political Islam that you know, that you can think about out there, it's a very complex terrain, is operating on this spectrum of simply a kind of revival of faith and identity. And this is where the politics, the jihad, the Islamization, the Islamic political parties, the fights over democracy, all of these things come into play. One has to recognize the political context. If you don't understand the political context of just the last 300 years of European colonialism, you won't be able to understand what's happening in the modern world today. And it is a grave mistake to think that all of a sudden Muslims are being violent because something in their faith tradition holds them to do so. Okay, there is nothing that demands that. If that was the case, the Ottoman Empire would never have stopped. If it was the case that Muslims are compelled by violence, okay, why aren't more of them compelled by violence? If it's the ideology of the texts, if Islam and the book are to blame, why aren't there more terrorists? All right, there's a great scholar up at UNC, Charlie Kurzman, who wrote a book called The Missing Martyrs. Why are there so few Muslim terrorists? He wrote this book after a young college student, disaffected, decided to drive his 4Runner on campus and kill as many kids as he could. Okay? He was compelled to write a book like that. I mean, what kind of person does it take to sort of look at that situation soberly and not react, right? So we want to really think about what are the, kind of larger historical and social forces out there at play that give rise to the politics that we're in. We're always in a position to come back to learn the specifics, to give you a reading list about each individual movement that's out there, from the Muslim Brotherhood to Hamas to Hezbollah. All of those will have their own specific historical circumstances, but none of those pieces of information are worth even exploring if you're not invested in this larger understanding of faith, identity, and civilization. So with that, I'd like to come back down and maybe just answer some more questions, if there's anything from the film or anything I just said in the last minute. Okay. One more question, I'm told. Is that okay? If you're, I'm not calling the shots. I'm not calling the shots. So one more question. Who's going to fight for it? I already heard from the fellow in the back, so I want some gender balance. Sorry. Go ahead.
I'd like to thank you again for doing this presentation. It was very enlightening. I had a question written down. Do you think mainstream Muslims today are as much a victim to these radical terrorist groups, or are they safe as Muslims from them, compared to non-Muslims?
The question is, are mainstream Muslims safe? You know, and are they in danger more or less than the radical extremists out there? So in a place like Europe, where the lone wolf terrorists are targeting Westerners, I would say the mainstream Muslims are probably not the most direct target, okay? But in Muslim societies where some of these terrorist networks are operating, there are no non-Muslims. So who are they killing? They're fighting other Muslims, all right? They're declaring war on other Muslims. And this is one of the most bewildering things for the mainstream Muslim community, because the sanctity of Muslim blood is something that's supposed to be inviolable, right? But what we find are grotesque bombings, sectarian bombings. You know, my wife and I were in Kuwait this summer, and I had just arrived in Kuwait, and there was a bombing. An ISIS suicide bomber had taken out a Shiite mosque. And Kuwait is relatively insulated from such activity. And it was quite shocking. There was about 27 people killed. And I attended the cemetery and buried some of those individuals. And the kind of national response was so overwhelming. People of all backgrounds in Kuwait. The conservative Salafi Wahhabis, okay, to the secular Shiites, secular Sunnis. Everybody was crowded in front of the blood banks donating blood. Everybody went to the cemetery. Everybody was in a united front against this act of terrorism. And it was the first time that I was so close to that kind of activity to feel the impact of how stark and how stark of a reality this thing is and how bewildering it really is. It's absolutely unfathomable. Most people are simply silenced by this kind of violence and perplexed by this violence. So in the Middle East, the people who suffer the brunt of all the violence you think about and see about, they're Muslims. In Ankara, just this week, there's a bombing. Istiklal. It'd be like blowing up Lennox, okay? What we see in Brussels, what we see in Paris, you know, these things have been happening with brutal violence in the Middle East for quite some time. And so part of our job as scholars and researchers is to go and explore how are Muslims dealing with this and what kind of solutions can they provide and offer to increase our capacity to deal with the problem together. So I'm more than happy to hang around if anybody wants to have more intimate conversations. And I want to thank everybody here again for spending the evening with me, and Dr. Ahmad for inviting me. Thank you again very much. And I hope to be able to come back down. It's a beautiful campus, much nicer than mine, I have to say. So thank you all very much.